Welcome everybody to the Salamander Festival this year. Even though we have the pandemic going on, we're actually really lucky because of that, because everything is virtual, that we're able to do the Salamander Story this year here at the Homewood Nature Preserve. So, this time we're going to talk about two salamanders, one named Mandy and one named Sal, who have lived up on this hillside here at the Homewood Nature Preserve, somewhere up on the hillside, possibly under one of those logs, but somewhere in the leaf litter. If you went to look for them, you would have a really hard time finding them because they don't stay on top of the leaves. They're down underneath in the dirt and the mulch and where everything is decomposing, because that is where they are able to find their food. And so Sal and Mandy had lived on this hillside for a number of years. And over the last spring and summer and into the fall, they had been burrowing around underneath all the leaves and the rotten logs and eating bugs, grubs, big fat grubs. Doesn't that sound good? Don't you want a nice fat grub for lunch? Maybe not? Okay. Me either, personally. But they love them, and they had gotten fat, and their little salamander tails had gotten fat. That's where they store all that good fat energy. And so the weather had started to get cold around late November, early December, and so Mandy and Sal were like, it's cold. And they can't wear a sweater like I can, or a jacket like maybe you've got on right now. And so they burrow down deeper into the soil and the leaf litter, down to a point where it's a nice consistent temperature and it stays moist all the time. And there they can put their head on a nice little bed of leaves and they can go to sleep. And Mandy and Sal had gone to sleep, and they were sleeping so good, and they were dreaming. They were dreaming about eating big fat grubs and running through the leaves. And it was a great dream. And then all of a sudden Sal woke up, and he couldn't figure out why he'd woken up out of such a good dream. And then he listened for a second, and he heard a sound. He heard this. And he thought, I bet I know what that is. And he began to crawl up out of his burrow and up to the top of the leaves. And not too far away, Mandy had woken up the same way, and she heard the same thing, and she said, I know what that means. And she crawled up to the top and up onto the top of the leaves, and all of a sudden, splat, right on top of her head, this big fat raindrop fell. But it wasn't a cold winter raindrop. No, it was a nice warm winter raindrop. The weather had warmed up, and so it was nighttime and it was raining, but it was a warm rain. And Mandy felt it, and she hollered out to Sal, Hey Sal, are you awake? Yes, I'm awake, Mandy. Do you know what this means? Yeah, it's time for the salamander dance. Yeah, let's go. And so they started off down the hillside. And you know, when you're only like this long, going down that big hillside, it's a lot of work. And so it took them a while. And they crawled over limbs, and they crawled under limbs, and they crawled under big fallen logs. And if they got to a rock that they couldn't go around or they couldn't go under, then they would actually crawl up and over the rock. And then all of a sudden, they got to a spot, and it was big, and it was dark, and it was hard, and it was wide. And you know where they had reached? They had reached that road right out there. And they stopped, and they thought, wow. And Mandy said, I can just barely see the other side. I know. How are we going to get across? Well, I guess we'll just have to run. Okay, on 3. 1, 2, stop! Zoom! Something went flying by him. It was a car, a big monster that had gone by on the road. Well, Sal and Mandy were pretty scared at that, and so they sat there and they waited, and they realized that cars, just like that car right there, were going by, back and forth, and that some of the salamanders were able to run across, but there were other salamanders that were getting squished, and they didn't want to be a squished salamander. So they sat for a little while and they waited, and finally they just said, we've got to go, we've got to get to the salamander dance. And so they said, okay, we're going to go. But then all of a sudden, Mandy saw something coming down the road. It was a light. She said, wait, Sal. And all of a sudden, these big, tall things with lights came up close to them, and they were holding these funny things up over them. They were umbrellas, because they were humans. And they stood there, and it took Sal and Sandy a little while to realize, but the humans were there to help them get across the road, because they had to get to the other side of the road to where their particular vernal pool of water was. And so, after they waited a minute or two and they realized they were safe, they went crawling across the road. And when they finally got to their vernal pool of water and they dove in, it felt so good because they were so tired from their long walk. And they partnered up with each other, and there were other salamanders in the pool, and they were partnered up, and everybody was dancing and swimming, and they swam and danced all night long, and they danced the next day, and they danced for a bunch of days until finally it began to rain again, another nice warm rain. And they said, it's time to go home. And so they crawled out of the pool and back across the road. This time, again, they had some help from some humans, and they crawled back up the hill to their burrows, and they burrowed back down. But behind, in that vernal pool, they had left hundreds of little salamander eggs that they and all the other salamanders that had danced had made while they were there. And so over the next month or so, those eggs became little baby salamanders. And those little baby salamanders lived in that vernal pool of water for several months until later in the spring, the pool began to dry up and the weather began to get warmer. And then one rainy night, they left the pool and they began to crawl. And they crawled across and back up into the forest, where they too began to dig their burrow, and they went to sleep for a while until it got warm enough for them to get out and eat grubs and grow big and strong, so that the next year they could also join Sal and Mandy in the salamander dance. So the next time in January, if it's a warm night and it's raining and you happen to have to drive down this road back here, then you make sure, unlike that car going fast, that you go slow and you watch the road. Or if you're with your parents, you tell your mom and dad, say, wait, slow down, because the salamanders might be crossing. And you want to watch, and if they are, you want to wait until they get out of your way. Or maybe get out and just help them on across. And so that way, they can go ahead and have their dance, and they can go on and live to the next year, so that we'll have lots of spotted salamanders all up in the forest.